Alright, so today we pick up with the Crusades, and Crusades are holy wars, wars that are fought in the name of religion. So it all gets its start when the Byzantine Emperor, remember the Roman Empire divided into two, you had the Western Roman Empire, which basically fell apart and led to the rise of the European nations, and then you had the Eastern Roman Empire, which was based in Byzantine and Constantinople. So the Byzantine Emperor is going to ask the Roman Pope for help in fighting off the Muslim Turks. Even though the Roman Church and the Eastern Roman Church were oftentimes enemies, Pope Urban II is going to agree to help them out. And so he calls together the Council of Clermont. And in the Council of Clermont, he's calling together the French and the German bishops, so the hierarchy of the church. And what he's going to do there is he's going to call for a crusade to free the Holy Land, or the land that, the biblical Holy Land. And so thousands of knights are going to make their way to the Holy Land, and they will be called Crusaders because they sew large crosses on their tunics, and in Latin, a cross is called cruces, and so people who are wearing cruces are called Crusaders. So that's how they get their name. But a lot of them are going to be inspired by priests and preachers and monks and people that are preaching about the need for them to go to the Holy Land. And so it's not just knights that are going, but there's a lot of ordinary men and women who also leave for the Holy Land too, in order to either provide support for the knights who are going or to go fight themselves. And unfortunately, many of those that don't have the proper training don't come back. Very few of them returned. So why are they doing this? Why are they going? Religion obviously plays a very large role in it. There was this idea to prove yourself to heaven that you were a true believer. Another part is that you could win land, you could win wealth. Anything that you captured could be yours, and you could become very wealthy this way as well. Some people are going to join the Crusades just to escape their troubles at home. Maybe they have a failing business, or maybe they have a wife they can't stand, and so this was a way to kind of get away from it all. And others, it's just going to be something different. It's the adventure part of it. The unknown is what's going to draw them. Now, the Pope himself had mixed motives himself for why he even called for these crusades. First off, it's going to increase his power in Europe, because if he can send knights to the Holy Land and they win, that's an enormous increase in his power and what he was able to accomplish and do. It may also heal the split between the Roman and Byzantine churches, that maybe this will bring them together again, that they will, or at least be able to cooperate more fully. Another motive would be that the lands in the Middle East could be an outlet for Europe's growing population, that a way to deal with that burgeoning population was to send them to the Middle East, where we now have lands that we are obviously going to need people there in order to keep control of it, so let's keep pushing people out there. And it also is going to have the added purpose of putting Christian knights to fight to purpose of fighting Muslims rather than fighting amongst themselves. So it gave them, according to the church, a more appropriate outlet for their need to fight. And so the Council of Clermont is going to lead to 200 years of crusaders going into the Holy Land. And for a time, they will occupy parts of Palestine. They will actually dominate the region for certain periods of time. But on the whole, it's mostly unsuccessful. But they do try. So we're going to look at some of the Crusades. We're not going to look at all of them. We're going to look at a few of them. The first Crusade is actually the only one that even came close to achieving its goals of taking over the Holy Land. It was a very long and bloody campaign in this first crusade, but they did capture the city of Jerusalem in 1099. On their part, they kind of made a really poor decision, because there was this huge massacre at Jerusalem when they captured the city. They celebrated their victory by killing all of the Muslim and all of the Jewish residents of the city, regardless of sex, regardless of age. They killed everybody. They took them out to the field surrounding the city and killed them all. Well, that obviously is going to lead to some need for revenge on the part of their families and their religious family as well to avenge their death. So later crusades that we see coming up, they will capture more and more lands, and eventually that land will be divided up into 4 small states that are called the Crusader states. And these 4 small states are called Edessa, Antioch, Tripoli, and Jerusalem. And so the Muslims are going to keep trying to conquer these Crusader states, which are going to prompt more crusades in order to defend them, to keep the Muslims from taking them back. And so we'll see more and more crusades take place, mostly just to defend the Crusader states. By 1187, Jerusalem falls and is back in Muslim hands, and the Muslims actually get a new leader called Salah ad-Din, and the English version of that is Saladin. So Salah ad-Din is his Muslim name, and Saladin is his English name. But he is a new leader that's going to come in by the Third Crusade, and he will help with the retaking of Jerusalem. So the Third Crusade, the Crusaders are coming in and they try to retake Jerusalem from the Muslims, but they fail. And after negotiations with Saladin, Saladin did reopen the city for Christian pilgrims to come in, because he recognized that Christianity had a base in Jerusalem, that there were fundamentally religious places that were very important to the religion that people wanted to visit. So he allows Christian pilgrims to come in. Other crusades will be fought against other Muslim lands, not just Jerusalem, but other Muslim lands as well. For example, the Fourth Crusade, the Crusaders were actually diverted from fighting the Muslims to fighting fellow Christians in this crusade, because what happens is that they set out from Italy to go to the Holy Lands, but they get lost on the way, and they end up seeing this city, and it's Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire, and they attack it. So they capture and they looted the capital of the Byzantine Empire. Well, the capital of Constantinople is Christian, and so you had these Christian crusaders going out thinking that they're fighting the Muslims, and they're actually fighting other Christians. And so, the Pope had hoped that this would help to heal the split between both sides of the church, and the Fourth Crusade kind of puts that to kibosh. It's not going to happen because they burned down the city of Constantinople, so it doesn't really work the way it was intended. Eventually, the Muslims will overrun the Crusader states. In fact, they capture the last Christian outpost in 1291, and it's at the city of Acre. And Acre is a port city, so a lot of Crusaders were trying to flee by getting on ships and sailing back to Europe through the city of Acre. Unfortunately, most of them don't get on board the ship. The city is overrun by the Muslims before most of them can get on. And the Muslims are going to massacre the Christians, just like the Christians massacred the Muslims at Jerusalem. And so there's this huge massacre of the Christians outside the city of Acre. Again, they line them all up on a plane and they behead them all. And again, it was regardless of sex and age. It was basically a final revenge for what had happened in Jerusalem almost 200 years earlier. So a lot of crusades are going to have some very poor endings and not be as successful at all. Like I said, the First Crusade was probably the only one that came close to even achieving its goal. But the impact of the Crusades, even though they failed to achieve their goal, which was conquering the Holy Land, it still had a lot of impact. It did leave behind a very bitter legacy of religious hatred between the Christians and the Muslims. Both sides committed atrocities. It's not like one side was to blame for it all. They both did it. And the Crusades, even though we don't win the Holy Land, the Crusades are going to kind of continue in Europe as they go against the Jews. So they're no longer focusing on the Muslims. Now they're going to focus on getting the Jews out of Europe. Now, there were some positive effects of the Crusades. It did quicken the pace of changes that were taking place. It did, kind of hurry things along because of political and social and religious aspects of it. It does increase the level of trade. Returning Crusaders are going to bring back things that they had won in their battles, like fabric and spices and perfumes. And the people back home are like, this is awesome stuff. We want more. And so it's going to increase the level of trade between countries. It's also going to increase the power of the church, which was one of the kind of motives for the Pope doing this in the first place. But it's a very short-lived amount of power, short-lived increase. It does not end the split in the Catholic Church that came, that actually widens or hardens as a result of the Fourth Crusade. The relationship actually gets worse as a result of that. It does increase or encourage the growth of the money economy, of using actual cash rather than goods, because the nobles needed cash. They needed money to equip themselves to become a crusader. You needed to have weapons, you needed to have armor, you needed to have supplies and food, and you needed to have like this entourage to go with you, to like your page and somebody to help you with your horse and all kinds of stuff. And so since the nobles needed actual cash, they have the peasants pay rent. And since the peasants need to have the cash to pay the rent, they're going to be selling their goods and services outside of their village or in their village, or finding ways to make cash. And so that actually leads to an end of serfdom. So the Crusades actually helped to quicken the pace of getting rid of serfdom. Another positive effect is that it led to a wider worldview, that the horizons sort of opened up for Europeans. They could visit far-off places like India and China and the Middle East and Africa. In fact, there's a famous person that begins his explorations during this time period. He's a Venetian called Marco Polo, and he goes to China with his father and uncle on a trade mission, and he actually ends up spending many years in China. And when he returns, he comes back with these stories that nobody believed. Everybody thought that he had died. Nobody thought he was who he really was. When he came back, nobody recognized him, and they're like, oh, that guy died years ago and never heard from him since. And so he showed up and he was telling all these stories about what he saw in China. So like in China, they had, at that time period, they had a government-run mail service where the government was in charge of the postal service. And people in Europe were like, what the heck? There's no way that could be possible. First off, the government wouldn't help us out like that. And secondly, how could it be possible? And so, because Europe didn't have anything even similar to that at all. He also returned with stories about black stones that could be burned in order to heat your homes. Well, he's talking about coal. And while there's a lot of coal in Europe, nobody had discovered what it could be used for yet. And so, again, they were like, these are all made up stories. There's no way this could possibly be true. And so Marco Polo had a lot to overcome because people thought he was crazy. And I'm sure you guys are familiar with the game of Marco Polo, right? Somebody's blindfolded and they say Marco and somebody else says Polo because you're trying to find him or find the people. And it's that game developed from Marco Polo's trip that, he was lost. And now you have to find, he had to be found and that kind of thing. So that is the Crusades and how they developed in Europe.